As people, I think we like to tell stories. We tell them all the time about ourselves and about other people. Sometimes they are harmless and fun, and sometimes they can even be empowering, but sometimes they can be restrictive, especially when those narratives are handed to us on account of the things that make us different. I want to talk about how we can take back control of those narratives which have been applied to us, and how each of us has the ability to rewrite the stories of who we are and who we can be. Being transgender, I was often told that my body looking the way it did meant that I had to be a girl, and being a girl meant that when I grew up, I would become a woman. This felt wrong to me, but the narrative had been told so many times, it felt as though it had become a part of the fabric of the universe. Eventually, like many of us do, I learnt the words to challenge this, but even then, I found myself being made to fit narratives that weren't mine. To be a trans man, I was told, often by cisgender people with no lived experience of existing in a trans body, to be a trans man was to be a man born into a female body. Even my doctors just accepted this as the default explanation, using phrases like, Charlie is a natal female, however, he identifies as male, as if bodies could only be described in relation to cis people's experiences, and only as a problem that has to be solved using the only model of maleness they could accept, cis masculine maleness. Now, I'm not saying that medical transition, changing my body with surgery and hormones, isn't the right thing for me, because it is, but it's not the whole story, and most importantly, changing my body hasn't made it any more male than it was before. My body now, with all its changes, is just as male as it was on the day I was born. Being trans for me isn't a problem of not being cis enough. My transness is embodied because my existence is, but it isn't confined to the parts of my body that don't look cis. It certainly isn't what my doctors were trying to describe when I was a teenager. And then when I was 18, I was suddenly handed new narratives about my body when I lost the ability to walk. It was as though my world had shrunk overnight. Places I used to visit, and even where I lived, were now out of reach in a very real sense, and people's expectations about what I could do with my life also changed drastically. Apparently now university and going out weren't possible for people who use wheelchairs, and finding love was, people assumed, completely off the table for me. Around that time, it often felt as though I was bouncing from one doctor's appointment to the next, and each time it was always the doctor and never me who was literally writing the story of what was going wrong. And every time, what was wrong was always conceived of in terms of my body, and always in lengthy medical jargon. At the root of all of it, apparently, was the story of a body that didn't fit, a female body of a trans man, a dysfunctional body of a disabled adult. But amongst all these doctor's appointments, and despite missing a fair amount of my last few months of sixth form, I was lucky enough to get a place at university. My doctors were fairly set in their belief that I shouldn't go, but thankfully I can be stubborn, and I'm really glad that I was, because university was the first time I'd gotten the opportunity to hear disabled people, rather than doctors, talk about disability, and the perspectives I heard turned my understanding of myself and what I was allowed to be on its head. All this time, I'd been told that my problems come from my body. I can't walk because of how my brain differs from a more biotypical brain, but that left out something big. Why was not being able to walk such a big problem in the first place? There have always been people who can't walk, and there will always be people who can't walk. So why is it that so many buildings are impossible to navigate when you use a wheelchair? My day-to-day problems didn't come solely from not being able to walk. They come from an incompatibility between how my body works and how my environment has been designed. Being trans, too, was not a problem simply of not appearing cis enough. A lot of the pain that I experienced from my gender was from living surrounded by such a restrictive view of what counts as male. Being cis and gender conforming isn't a blank slate of gender, it's just one way of being out of many. Our bodies and our lives are not here to be defined in terms of what they are not, unless we want them to be. They aren't simply a vessel for other people to tell their stories. Other people are always going to try and define what is possible for those of us whose bodies fall into the category of other, But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that at any point we could take back the narrative and make our own ones. It's up to us to define our possibilities. As people, we like to tell stories, but the only person who can tell yours is you.
There we go. Hello, everybody. Sorry, technology. You've got to love it. Or maybe it's just me. Well, welcome, everyone. Firstly, I want to say, Charlie, thank you so much for recording that amazing talk. And today is an opportunity for all of us to get to know you a little bit better. So I wanted to start off by asking you, Charlie, if you could just introduce yourself briefly, if that's okay.
Hi, I'm Charlie. I use he, him pronouns. I don't know what to say. I've been involved with Proud to Be for like so long now. I went to the youth group when I was like 15 and never really left. So, yeah.
I know. And it has been a long time. And yeah, it has been a long time. And I think, you know, why we asked you to be part of Totnes Pride Online, not just because you are fabulous and amazing and such an instrumental part of Proud to Be, but I think your story is a very interesting one that is often not shared or given the spotlight. And so we're going to ask people to ask some questions. As always, if there are any questions, Charlie, that you do not want to answer, you absolutely don't have to, and you don't have to justify why you don't want to answer those. I'll be picking up the questions from the chat bar, and I know that Maya's been chatting with people over the chat bar, so if you want to send them to me or to the general chat, if you feel comfortable, and we'll go from there. We should be finished by 3:00. So just so everyone knows, and if Maya, you'd like to make sure that I'm keeping on time, because I'm not very good at doing that by myself. Right, let us get started. Have we got any questions, or shall I start with one? Let me have a look. Okay, maybe I will start with one. Oh, Maya, thank you for promising to keep me in time. That's very good. Right. Charlie, relating to kind of what you said on your video and the title of the talk, how similar is your experience from like other people's like reactions and responses to you? Is it for you being disabled and being trans? Are there similarities or are there not similarities?
There are definitely similarities. I think in the way that other people seem to have this idea of what it means to be disabled and what it means to be trans before you even enter the room, and that almost gets put on you. And yeah, there are things that are different, but there are definitely a lot of similarities. And the things that I've learned from being disabled are the things that tend to transfer quite well into being trans. Sort of this idea that, okay, my body is different, but that's okay, and the difference isn't bad, and the difference isn't a problem. And that's something I learned from being disabled, and it's something I learned from being trans, and it's equally applicable to both, I think.
Yeah, and I really liked what you said during your talk about, or it's almost about reframing that narrative that disabled people are the problem, or that trans people are the problem, or that trans people's problems are that they are not cis enough, or they do not look cis enough, but actually reframing it to see that it's actually society that has the problem, you know?
Yeah, I think definitely that is really applicable in both. I spent like a lot of time, and I think another thing that's quite typical of both is just the medicalization of basically your whole life. Like when you're trans, my experience certainly has been, you know, you go into a doctor's office and your whole life is it's almost medicalized in terms of like, oh well, what do you like to wear, and that gets written in medical reports. And then being disabled as well, like everything you do and everything you can't do is in terms of
it's all in terms of medical stuff again. And it's sort of letting go of that and saying, actually, my life isn't just what gets written in medical reports. It's not relevant a lot of the time. And saying that being trans not being a medical thing, and being disabled as well to an extent isn't, I don't think, a medical thing. It's a lot more cultural, it's a lot more social than I think a lot of the time that we think.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. We've got a question from the lovely Maya. Here we go. Do people ask you personal and inappropriate questions? If so, how do you deal with that?
Yes, definitely. My disability is quite visible. You can't see at the moment, but I use a wheelchair full time. I used to have a very visible feeding tube that I don't use currently, but if I'm out and about, people definitely, I am visibly disabled. I also, I give talks at Pride. I'm very involved with Proud to Be, so I'm quite openly trans, and so I do get a lot of questions. The way I deal with them depends. You can usually tell whether a question's coming from a bad place, I think, or whether it's curiosity. Like I get a lot of questions from children, and I'm usually fine with those because they come from a place of curiosity.
Mm.
And even when they're from adults, if it's coming from that place of wanting to learn, then it's usually, it can even be like a good way of starting a conversation. Even if I'm not comfortable answering that question, it's a good way of saying, oh, well, I don't normally answer that, but here's something else that you might want to know.
Yeah.
It's when it comes from that sort of confrontational place that normally I will be like, no, I'm not going to answer that. I'm not going to engage. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's such an important position, it seems, that and I think this came up yesterday in one of the discussions around not owing anybody anything, particularly when it comes to your private information and your experience, and being able to own that. And it's not always easy, and lots of factors come in, but just to have that in your head, in your mind, that you don't owe anyone.
I think that balance was definitely hard. Like at first, I was definitely on the lines of no, I must be the best representation of everything I am. And that's an awful lot of pressure, especially when you're younger and you feel like you have to be the best possible representation of disabled people, of trans people. And actually you don't have to be. And there are days if you are too tired or you just don't want to talk, then that is okay. And that's something I'm having to teach myself as I go along, that it's okay not to have these conversations if it's not the right day or it's not the right time or if you just don't feel like it.
Absolutely. We've got a question from Ali, but before we go to that question, I just want to go on from what you were saying about this idea about being, I always say like being a good trans person or a good disabled person in terms of what's expected from society. What would you do? Can you kind of say a few things about what does a good disabled person look like for other people's perceptions and that pressure?
From what I can tell, a good disabled person is somebody who doesn't actually talk about being disabled except in a really inspirational way, I'm going to make everyone feel better because I did this thing, so therefore you can, or stuff like that. And it's someone who never says, actually, I can't get into that building and I want to, or, oh, I can't access this. And that's, if you're trying to do that, it's so lonely because there are places you can't get to. And if you don't feel able to say, actually, there's an issue here, then you're not going to be happy if you're not valuing yourself enough to say, actually, this could be better.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, and just being honest about that. Yeah. Okay. So, Ali did ask a question. I do want to raise it because I think there's more to explore there. In terms of balancing activism and privacy, how do you do that?
Oh, that's a tricky one. I don't think I do it the best. I I think there's definitely somewhere I've got to learn. Initially, when I was at school and I was, the only openly trans person there, I felt all the time that I had to change everything. Like everything was on my shoulders, and that was too much. Like looking back, I can see that I definitely took on too much. Do I continue to do that to an extent? Yes. I don't think there's anywhere I've been to where I haven't tried to change something, tried to make it a little bit better. I think it will depend on everyone. You've got to feel what you're comfortable sharing and what you're not. And just reminding yourself every now and then that you don't owe the world everything. You don't owe every single ounce of who you are to change the world. Like you can keep some stuff back for you, and you should, and it will make your activism better. It's not like a selfish thing. It's necessary to just keep going.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, those boundaries are so important. Thanks, Charlie. Okay, a few more questions. Oh, they're I'm going to have to scroll up. This is good. Here we go. This is from, okay, here we go. I'm being honest, I don't know whether to say people's names because this is being recorded, so I'm going to stop saying people's names. Unless you want me to say them, leave them in your questions. Can you think of any advice for people who struggle with sharing their voice and experiences in a majority abled non-queer society?
Get a good community around you, whether it's online or in person, of other queer disabled people. It's been so valuable for me just finding those people who were like me, and it gives you that space to breathe, and it gives you almost that reality check of, no, what I'm saying isn't too much, what I want isn't, it's not, me being too aggressive or too insistent on change. It's necessary and it's okay. And I think finding those people and getting that support, whether it's people you meet online or people in person, it's so important to surround yourself with people like you, if you're otherwise not surrounded by it.
Absolutely. And interestingly, in your talk, you spoke about how going to university helped to kind of change your perception on maybe how you felt about your kind of activism, or when you asked for what you needed.
Yeah, I think the people that you're around, and we're so lucky now that we've got the internet and that we can find these people where, otherwise it would have been really difficult. But there are people like you out there, even when it feels like nobody is like you at all. There are people, and we are findable online.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, next question. Hi, Charlie, great talk. How can a cisgendered, able-bodied, non-disabled person be an ally to disabled and transgender people?
Ooh, that's
a big question. Yeah.
I think first and foremost, listening to you come here today. That's pretty good. Find people online, see what they're talking about. No one of us knows everything. But also noticing around you what's accessible, especially, in queer communities. Not everything is accessible still. And that means that there are places that I can't even get my voice heard because I can't get through the door. And noticing things like that and bringing it up and be like, hey, this could be better. I think that's a really good place to start.
Someone mentioned, I think it was CN Lester in a talk a few years ago about when those challenges come from different types of people, it kind of strengthens.
Yeah.
I suppose it relates to power, which maybe we want to dismantle that idea, but like you say, it's not just about disabled people challenging ableism.
Yeah.
Everybody.
Yeah, I think when it comes from more than one place, it gets taken more seriously. And we can talk for years about whether or not it should be taken differently, but I think the world we're in now, it does make a difference if it's also able people saying, hey, this isn't right. And it's, it's sad that does make a difference, but I think it does.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, here's another question. What have you learnt most? I'll say it's from Maya, because Maya won't mind. What have you learnt most about yourself throughout your journey?
Gosh.
And you define journey for yourself.
Oh gosh, what have I learned? Probably that I will probably never know everything about myself, and that I don't need to. I don't need to have all the answers, and it's okay. And that's a perfectly fine way to be.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the time you're expected to know, you're expected to be able to list your diagnoses, you're expected to know exactly when you knew you were trans, and it's okay to not know. And I think the fact that I don't know all the answers is probably the biggest thing and the most important thing that I've learned.
Absolutely, yeah. That's such a good life lesson, isn't it? That kind of surrender to that, you know? Because I think, would you say that as, let's say, as a trans person, are you expected, is there an expectation for you to know all the answers, for you to have a degree in gender studies, to be able to...
Like, ever since I came out when I was like 15, you're expected to know all of these really complicated, like nuanced things. As when you're like literally a child, you're expected to know and be able to defend all sorts of things that are just, that I'm still learning at university, and you're expected to know them when you've just come out. It's such a big like expectation, and nobody can live up to it. Like, trying to live up to it, you're never ever going to get there, because it doesn't exist. Nobody knows all the answers about themselves,
Absolutely. One thing I really wanted to talk to you about is privilege, and I'll share a very quick story because I think it highlights my privilege, and I want you then to talk about that if you will, Charlie. So, a couple of years ago when we were doing Totnes Pride, we were trying. If ever anyone knows Totnes, they'll know that the actual physical locations, there's not many accessible. Certainly, no, there's not. I mean, we struggled, didn't we, Charlie? But we tried our best, and I remember Charlie was taking part in a panel discussion, and I had in my head the venue because I'd been there before, and Charlie asked me, "Is there a ramp? Is there even a small step?" And I was like, "No, no, I don't think so." And then when we got there, we saw that there was a small step, and that highlighted to me privilege in me, because I didn't need to know whether it was accessible, because I could access it whatever. How much do you think privilege comes into place in terms of people acknowledging you when you're when you're trying to access buildings, etc.?
I think it definitely, I've had, it's just one step, as if that doesn't matter, so many times. I think people don't realize what they don't know. And it's a lot of people, you don't have to think about it. It's something that doesn't even cross your mind until it needs to. It's something that didn't cross my mind until I needed to. And a lot of the people I'm friends with who can walk, who don't have those access barriers, the same ones that I do, suddenly start noticing all the things that aren't accessible, because you think, it must be, it's 2020, there must be some way around it, and so often there isn't, and it surprises people, I think. Not from a bad place, just from a place of genuinely not knowing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Charlie. I'll go back to the chat because we've got a few questions. Okay. Who are your role models? That's from Maya.
Oh, who are my role models? Oh gosh, that's such a big question. You know when someone asks you a question like that and your mind just like forgets all the people you've ever met?
Maya's asking all of those questions today. It's a difficult one, isn't it? You can come back to that one.
Yeah.
Would that help?
I think I'm going to have to. I've just completely forgotten everyone's names.
No, that's absolutely fine, Charlie. We might come back to that. Okay, here we go. You mentioned that you try and change something, at least in a small way, for the better in each space you find yourself in. What spaces, places, institutions have you found to be the most receptive to this and the most resistant to change? You don't have to name places if you don't feel comfortable to. Great question.
That is a really good question.
Well, questions. So, yeah.
Yes. I think when I was working a lot more with Totnes Pride, the stuff that we brought in there, you guys were pretty good at and receptive. Like we've got a lot of changes in the past few years, which has been more. I find that generally the bigger like an organization is, the harder it is just to be heard in the first place. So like places like universities, it can be really hard to find the right way in and the right people to talk to. Yeah. Especially if they're, places that have been going a long time and they've always done things in a certain way. And places where, you can talk to one person who really will like be really helpful and really want to do something, but then they can only do so much. So I think, the bigger and less sort of grassroots an organization can be, the harder it is sometimes, but not always. There's no like rule of who's going to listen and who's going to not.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? That kind of, sometimes the bigger an organization gets, the harder it is for things to be achieved, because there's that kind of red tape. Let me see if I've... Oh, here we go. Here we go. Have your friendships changed since you started your transition?
Yeah, definitely. I had quite a difficult experience when I transitioned at school. And some people I just sort of lost touch with almost. They didn't quite know what to make of it. But, at the same time, I was 18 and then I went off to university. So friendships change anyway for everyone. I think there was anyone who goes, leaves school and doesn't have their friendship groups change. So it's hard to say what was being trans and what was, just being young.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Here we go. This is really informative. Thanks, Charlie. Question. Have you had any experiences, I'll start that again. Have you had experiences of being othered within mainstream LGBT plus community, or at Pride events?
Yes. That was easy. Yeah, I think it's very frustrating when you go to places that you want to be accessible because you think this is, the LGBT community, it's about being accepted, and then you can't access things. I remember I spent half an hour at Trans Pride Brighton just to try and find a toilet that I could use the other year, because it was half an hour to an hour just to use the toilet. That was quite difficult. And there have been other events where even someone looking, if you can't, there's no way for a wheelchair user to get onto the stage. So you're like, I could never be represented here, even if, even though this is supposed to be about lifting up the community, when you see barriers like that, even if you're not talking but you just see a stage where you cannot get to, and it's just not thought about, then it does have an impact, I think.
What message does it send out when a pride event or any event, there are spaces like stage? I mean, for me, a stage represents like having your voice heard on that kind of platform.
Yeah.
What message does it send to you when you are not physically able to access that space?
It sort of says, you're here to listen, we're not here to listen to you. It's the most dramatic way of saying it, I think, is you know, this isn't a space for you to be heard, it's a space for you to listen. Which is, you know, it's a shame. And it says, you know, it shows you what's possible. If you can't physically access something, it does impact your belief about what you think is going to be possible for you. And I think that's, you know, that's a real shame.
Absolutely, yeah. Those messages that shape how we think about ourselves and our future. Why do you think, big question alert, why do you think, and maybe it's obvious, but why do you think society is built in a way that is so aggressively structured towards people who can walk, like able-bodied people and etc.?
That's a huge question.
Thank you.
I don't think there's one big reason, but I think it comes back to what's considered normal and what's considered other. And if you're considered normal, you're okay, you're in public, you get to live in public, you can be open. If you are other, then you are pushed to the sides. I think whether that's with disability, being LGBT, whether it's race, whatever it is, if you're other, you're pushed to the sides. You know, there's histories, you know, of institutionalization, there's all kinds of cultural things that weigh into it, but I think a lot of it comes down to that. If you're normal, you're okay. If you're othered, you are not.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One thing I wanted to talk to you about, and it's potentially like, obviously these are all really personal questions, the relationship between your transition and your disability and how that has been perceived, managed, particularly by kind of medical experts. Like, I just want to reiterate, you don't have to answer, only say what you feel comfortable saying. Yeah. But I just think that's a really important, something we need to kind of maybe.
I think it's interesting, medical experts. I don't know how expert some of these people are. I transitioned when I was 15. When I was 18, I lost the ability to walk. About a year and a half later, I had a doctor at a gender identity clinic try and say that the reason I was identifying as trans was because I was actually secretly really upset that I couldn't walk. And that's why I thought I could solve that problem, which didn't exist when I transitioned. But I was trying to solve the fact I couldn't walk by transitioning. I have spent so long trying to unravel the logic of that statement, and I genuinely don't know where it came from, except as a belief that being trans is a problem and being disabled is a problem. Therefore, they must be the same problem. It's the only thing I could think of. But I've had, my experience of transition has definitely been shaped by my disability. And my experience with disability has been shaped by how I'm trans. You know, every time I interact with a medical professional, I know that I'm carrying with me both of those things, that I'm going to hope that they're going to be okay with both of them. And occasionally they can be, but often if they don't have an issue with me being trans, it's with me being disabled. And I think, yeah, there's definitely a big issue with accessing healthcare for disabled people if your body differs from what doctors think is normal and okay. they're a lot more hesitant to prescribe hormones or to refer for surgery because there are more unknowns, and unknowns are dangerous. So yeah, it's yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, sorry to put you on the spot about that, and I hope that you feel okay kind of talking and sharing about that experience, because I mean, it still shocks me today, this idea that because you're disabled, you don't get to have like autonomy over your, you know, who you are, and the decisions that are being made for you, like in terms of medical stuff. One thing I'll come to the questions in a second, but following on from what you've just said, sometimes there seems to be a little bit of conflict, or from certain parts of the LGBT community or other LGBTQ plus organisations, about talking about disability at the same time as talking about gender, sexual and romantic identity. I wonder if you want to talk about that at all, and what if you've had an experience of that.
Yeah, I think because of like there's quite complex history with medicalization and being LGBT, things like conversion therapy, it can be quite emotionally evocative for some people to talk about them in the same breath, almost as if we talk about LGBT disabled people, we risk accidentally saying that LGBT people are inherently disabled. And I think it's a real shame that is the case. And it's definitely something that we do need to move past and be okay talking about, because being disabled influences, every aspect of your life, just like being LGBTQ does. You don't like put your disability down when you walk in to a pride event, and you don't, put your LGBT identity down when you're trying to arrange social care. Like, they're with you all of the time, and do intersect in ways that need to be talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think that's it's almost like when it comes to intersectionality, it's almost like, I mean, I've heard of other people say, someone who is LGBTQ plus and disabled come to a group or an organisation, and when they started talking about their disability, the LGBTQ plus group organisations say, no, we don't talk about that here. We're about sexuality and gender. You need to, basically you need to go to somewhere else to talk about that.
Yeah, it's difficult because then you go to a disabled group and you talk about, being LGBTQ, and it's, oh, we don't talk about that here. We talk about disability. And when when you're trying to talk about, perhaps difficulty with carers accessing spaces or having to come out to your carers, it's, where is the space to talk about that if you can only talk about one at a time? Where do you talk about those things? Which, we need to have those spaces, and I think we need to have those conversations because it is important.
Absolutely. Thanks, Charlie. Right, back to the chat. Okay, here we go. Have you had many positive experiences with doctors or medical professionals, or have they been mainly negative?
Unfortunately, the ones that I remember as positive are definitely the minority. But there are good doctors out there. They do exist. And I have had a few good experiences where I have felt that everything I've said has been listened to. And even if the doctor doesn't come to the appointment with the understanding to start with, they are open-minded. They're willing to listen, to learn. I think that's the bit that really makes a difference, is how willing is this professional to maybe reevaluate what they've been taught and what they've learned. And when they are willing to listen and to learn, then you can have the possibility for really great understandings, even if they've never met a trans person before. If they come willing to learn about pronouns, to learn how important those things are, then you're much more likely to have a positive experience.
Yeah. And maybe one day you won't have to educate the trained professionals.
Maybe that would be good.
Yeah. Okay, a few more questions. How can able-bodied members of the LGBTQ plus community help to change things, particularly with the medical profession?
Oh, that's a big question.
Maya's not to blame for that one this time.
Gosh, I think it's really difficult when you're talking to medical professionals, because so often, if you're doing that as a patient, you know, you've got to be focusing on yourself in that situation. Probably, if you know doctors outside of that kind of interaction, then that's, or like medical professionals, that's probably a good place to start, is talk to the people you know, whether, they work in healthcare, if they're a nurse or an HCA, or, even a doctor. Talking to them outside of that setting is probably a really good place to start and talk about disability, talk about being LGBTQ in a setting that's not work, if you're in a position to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. And following on from that, in terms of, say, venues that aren't accessible, what would you say? Because it feels like, take Totnes, for example. Your experience will be obviously more valid but from doing the research for Totnes Pride and stuff. It's like ridiculously inaccessible. What would you say? Like, how can we protest as able-bodied people? Should we not go to those places and make it really, really clear that that's how can we actually be of use and do something? Because it needs to change. Of course, it needs to change.
Yeah, I think if you're booking like events like Totnes Pride, if you're not using venues that aren't accessible, it does really send that message of, if it's not accessible, it's not, it's not worthwhile booking the space. That's a really, really powerful way of sending that message. I think also asking people, if you are looking into venues, or if you're going out, like, oh, what's the access like? Is there wheelchair access? Is there a hearing loop? Like, asking those questions makes venues that might not have even thought about it think about it. Yeah. I think the more that we talk about it, the more we ask those questions, the more the places are going to see that actually they could be doing better and they could be getting more people in.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let me make sure that I've got all the questions. Okay, final question from the chat bar. In your experience, how many medical professionals have taken Intersectionality 101?
None. I don't think.
What is it? This might be an ignorant question, but what is Intersectionality 101?
Intersectionality is the idea that you can have the experience of being in one marginalized group and being in another marginalized group, but the sum of the two doesn't equal the experience of being in both marginalized groups. So it started with women of color saying that if you're Black and if you're a woman, your experience isn't that of a Black man plus a white woman added together. You have a different experience of racism and sectionalism as they intersect. And it can be applied to other groups. So me being trans and me being disabled, I don't have the experience of an able-bodied cis person, or I don't have the experience of an able-bodied trans person plus a cisgender disabled person. I have other things that the way that the two intersect. So, the way that I have to think about in my interactions with medical professionals isn't just the two added together. There's something else on top of that.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the time it's difficult, and doctors and medical professionals aren't aware of it, because a lot of the training you have your LGBT training day, and then you have your disability awareness day, and they don't necessarily talk about other experiences. Goes back to what you were saying with LGBT organizations that don't talk about disability, that just talk about LGBT issues. And ideally, we need to be talking about the way that they intersect. Because if you just take, oh, well, your experience must be that of a cisgender disabled person and an able-bodied trans person, you're not going to get to the root of everything that I experience.
Yeah. Do you think it's almost people's need, I guess, to put people in one box and understand them as that one box? And then when you talk about intersecting identities, and that actually that's not the way that it works, it's like, oh no, like, get in your box.
With all the monitoring forms for equality, there is like that list of protected characteristics, and it's sort of, everyone's like, well, if we address this characteristic and then like we address that one, then we'll cover all of it. And it just, people are more complicated than that. Almost everyone fits into more than one of those boxes. We're all complicated people. We all have complex identities, and you can't get to the bottom of that by just focusing on one thing at a time.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. A comment on the chat says, "Great explanation of intersectionality, Charlie." Here. Yeah, it's and I thought, gosh, this is so my ignorance, but I thought when you said Intersectionality 101, I thought it was almost like a training course that medical professionals could take. So that's, anyway.
If it is, I've not heard of it. It'd be great if it was.
I know, it would be great, actually. It would be really great. I've just looked up 101. It means a beginner's guide. There should be. Yeah. Anyway, maybe that's the next thing. Intersectionality 101. Right, we have a few minutes left, and just giving anyone the opportunity to ask any final questions. Send them through before we finish. Is there anything that you would like what is, again, a big question, but is there anything that you feel like people should know, whether it's something that reflects in kind of current climate environment, or just anything you'd like to say, Charlie?
Oh gosh, big questions again.
I'm sorry.
I don't know. Probably that not everything is straightforward, and that we all know ourselves better than anybody else can know us. And if what someone's saying about you doesn't seem right, it probably isn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Checking in with what you feel, what you know about yourself. I'll just read a few responses, and I've got one question that's probably going to be a bit ironic, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Just want to say that Charlie is amazing. Charlie, you are so gracious in your responses. Thank you so much. Brilliant. Intersectionality is such an important concept, but not easy to summarize. Absolutely. And I think you've done that amazingly well today. Okay, my last question. Do you ever get sick about talking about disability? Are you asked about it a lot? Are you expected to talk about it a lot? I know that's where the irony is, because I'm talking to you, asking you questions about disability, but how do you feel about that?
Sometimes it depends whether I'm doing it on my terms or not. Like sometimes I'll get sick of it if it's come up in class and everyone's turned around to look at me because I'm the most visibly disabled person in a room. Like that gets a bit tiring. But when it's on my own terms, like something like this, it's planned, it's not talked about enough. I think it's that duality of it's talked about too much, not on our terms, and not enough on our terms. So I think, yeah, I do not get sick of it when you're talking about it on our terms. That's, we don't get enough of that. Do I get sick of it when it's not on my terms? Yes, and I think everyone does about anything.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Charlie. That's really, really helpful to know. And I just want to say thank you so much for being here today and doing your talk. It's just always great to hear you talk and hear your kind of feelings and you know.
Thank you for having me. It's been, yeah, been really good.
And I know from the comments, people have really, really enjoyed your talk. Brilliant, interesting talk. Thank you, Charlie. Thank you, Charlie. Yeah, more to come, I hope, Charlie. And thank you so much to Kitty and Fraser for interpreting this wonderful event. And we will be back this evening at 7:30, and we're going to be playing Out of Order, which is a great film from a local director. So if you want to find out more information about that, Maya, as if by magic, has put the link in the chat bar, but it's also up on all of our social media today. Again, thank you, Charlie. Love you to bits. Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone for being here and interacting so beautifully. We'll see you very soon. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.